At 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Mess Attendant 3rd Class Doris Miller was collecting laundry in the sleeping quarters below deck on the USS West Virginia, berthed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. He was 22 years old, from Waco, Texas, and had been in the Navy for 2 years. His assignment was serving meals to officers and handling their laundry. The Navy didn't allow black sailors to serve in combat ratings. They could be mess attendants, stewards, or cooks. Nothing else. Miller heard an explosion. The deck beneath his feet shuddered violently. Then another explosion. Then several more in rapid succession. The general quarters alarm began sounding. Miller dropped the laundry and ran toward his battle station. In the Navy, every sailor had an assigned battle station, a specific location where they were supposed to report during combat or emergencies. Miller's battle station was in an ammunition magazine deep in the ship's hull. His job during battle would be to pass ammunition up to the guns. Miller ran through the passageways toward his station. The ship was already listing to port. Water was coming in somewhere. The explosions continued, shaking the entire vessel. Miller reached the area where his battle station was located and found the passageway flooded. The compartment was inaccessible. Water was pouring in from ruptured hull plates. Men were struggling to close watertight doors to contain the flooding. With his battle station unreachable, Miller did what Navy training dictated. He headed topside to report to any officer who could give him orders. He emerged onto the deck into chaos. The battleship USS Arizona, moored ahead of the West Virginia, was burning. Smoke poured from multiple ships across the harbor. Aircraft with red circles on their wings dove and climbed above the harbor. Bullets and shrapnel filled the air. The noise was overwhelming. Explosions, aircraft engines, anti-aircraft guns, men shouting. Miller saw Lieutenant Commander Dwar Johnson standing near the conning tower, trying to organize damage control efforts. Miller reported to Johnson. Johnson looked at Miller, looked at the chaos around them, and made a quick decision. Miller, come with me. The captain's been hit. We need to move him. They ran toward the bridge. Captain Mervyn Benyon, the West Virginia's commanding officer, was lying on the deck of the bridge, gravely wounded. A fragment from an armor-piercing bomb that had hit the nearby Tennessee had struck Captain Benyon in the abdomen. He was conscious, but unable to move. Johnson ordered Miller to help carry the captain to a safer location. Miller and another sailor, Ensign Victor Delano, attempted to move Captain Benyon. But the captain was bleeding badly, and moving him caused him obvious pain. Benyon told them to leave him and attend to the ship. Johnson reluctantly agreed. He left Delano to stay with the captain while he went to assess damage to other parts of the ship. Miller found himself on the bridge with little to do. The captain was being tended to by Delano. The bridge crew was busy trying to coordinate the ship's response to the attack. The West Virginia had already been hit by multiple torpedoes and bombs. The ship was listing heavily to port, settling deeper into the water. Fires were spreading on the deck. Men were abandoning positions that were no longer tenable. Miller looked around and saw 2.50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine guns mounted on the bridge level. Both guns were unmanned. Their regular crews were either dead, wounded, or had abandoned the positions. The guns were still operational, ammunition belts fed into them, barrels pointing at empty sky. Japanese aircraft continued to strafe the harbor. Dive bombers were attacking ships. Torpedo bombers were making runs at battleships still afloat. And no one was manning these two machine guns. Miller had never been trained on the .50 caliber machine gun. He'd never been trained on any weapon. Mess attendants didn't receive weapons training. That was for ratings that black sailors weren't allowed to hold. Miller had seen the guns being fired during drills. He'd watched the gun crews operate them when the ship practiced anti-aircraft defense. But he'd never touched one himself. He walked over to the nearest gun. It was a Browning M 2.50 caliber machine gun, mounted on a pedestal mount that allowed it to swivel and elevate. The gun had a spade grip in the back with a thumb trigger. An ammunition belt fed into the left side. The gun was relatively simple to operate by design. Point it, press the trigger, it fires. The complexity was in leading the target, judging distance and speed, and controlling the burst length. Miller grabbed the spade grips. The metal was already hot from the sun, and perhaps from earlier firing. He looked down the barrel, saw a Japanese aircraft approaching from the east. It was a Aichi D-3, a dive bomber, what the Americans would later call a VAL. The aircraft was pulling out of a dive after dropping its bomb on a target elsewhere in the harbor. It was climbing maybe 800 feet altitude, moving at approximately 200 miles per hour. Miller swung the gun toward the aircraft, pressed the thumb trigger. Nothing happened. The gun didn't fire. Miller looked at it, confused. He noticed a charging handle on the right side of the gun. During drills, he'd seen gun crews pull that handle back before firing. He pulled it. It was stiff, requiring significant force. The handle moved back about 6 inches and then locked. Miller pressed the trigger again. The gun roared to life. The sound was deafening, a rapid hammering that shook the entire gun mount. Spent brass casings ejected from the right side of the gun, clattering onto the deck. The gun barrel climbed with recoil. Tracers arced out toward the ocean, well below and behind the Japanese aircraft. Miller released the trigger. The gun stopped firing. He'd been holding the trigger too long, wasting ammunition, not hitting anything. During drills, he'd heard officers shouting at gun crews about firing discipline. Short bursts, 3 to 5 seconds. Lead the target. Don't chase tracers. Another aircraft appeared, this time from the south. A Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber called a Kate by Americans, though Miller didn't know that designation. The aircraft had apparently already dropped its torpedo at some target and was departing the harbor at low altitude, maybe 400 feet, following the water. Miller swung the gun, led the aircraft by what seemed like a reasonable amount. Pressed the trigger. Another burst, maybe 4 seconds. The tracers arced out. They passed behind the aircraft. Miller had led it, but not enough. The aircraft was faster than he'd estimated. He adjusted, led the aircraft more, fired another burst. This time the tracers converged closer to the aircraft, but still missed, passing just behind its tail. The aircraft disappeared behind the smoke from burning ships. Miller didn't know if he'd hit it or not. He hadn't seen any visible damage. Probably a miss. The attack continued. Japanese aircraft were everywhere. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters strafing the harbor and ships. Miller kept the gun pointed at the sky, searching for targets. A Zero fighter appeared, strafing the West Virginia's deck. The Zero was low, maybe 300 feet, moving fast, perhaps 300 miles per hour. Miller tracked it, led it, fired. A long burst, maybe 6 seconds. He saw his tracers. Some passed in front of the Zero, some behind it. He was bracketing the target, but not hitting it. The Zero continued its strafing run, bullets kicking up water in the harbor, stitching across the deck of a nearby vessel, then climbing away to the north. Ensign Delano, still with Captain Benyon, shouted at Miller. Shorter bursts. You're wasting ammunition. Miller nodded, didn't respond verbally. He was focused on finding the next target. Another dive bomber appeared, a D-3, pulling up after an attack run. Miller tracked it, led it by what seemed like twice the aircraft's length, fired a 3-second burst. The tracers converged on the aircraft. Miller saw hits. Flashes along the aircraft's wing and fuselage. Small pieces of debris flew off the aircraft. The Japanese plane continued flying. It didn't explode, didn't fall from the sky, didn't catch fire. It continued climbing, heading north toward the mountains. But Miller had hit it. He'd seen the impacts. First confirmed hits. The problem with aerial gunnery from a ship was that it was nearly impossible to know if you'd actually shot down an aircraft unless it crashed immediately in your view. Aircraft could sustain significant damage and still fly for miles before crashing. They could catch fire, and the fire might not be visible from the ground. They could be mortally damaged, but maintain altitude long enough to get out of sight. Miller had hit that aircraft. Whether he'd shot it down or merely damaged it, he couldn't know. He continued firing. Another B-5N torpedo bomber appeared, this one higher up, maybe 1,000 feet, having apparently already dropped its torpedo. Miller tracked it, let it, fired. Another 3-second burst. Hits. He saw flashes along the fuselage. The aircraft's left wing dipped, as if the pilot had been hit or had lost control momentarily. The aircraft recovered and continued north, but it was clearly damaged. 2 hits. 2 aircraft damaged. Miller was learning. The key was lead. The aircraft was moving across his field of view. The bullets took time to reach the aircraft. By the time the bullets arrived where the aircraft had been when he pulled the trigger, the aircraft was somewhere else. He needed to aim where the aircraft would be, not where it was. The faster the aircraft, the more lead required. The farther away, the more lead required. Another Zero appeared, closer this time, maybe 500 feet altitude, diving toward the harbor to strafe. Miller tracked it as it came toward him. This was an easier shot. The aircraft was moving toward his position, not across his field of view. Less lead required. Miller centered the gun on the Zero's nose, fired a 4-second burst. The tracers converged directly on the Zero's engine cowling. Multiple hits. The Zero's engine began smoking immediately. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The aircraft's dive steepened. The Zero was losing power, losing control. It passed over the West Virginia at less than 200 feet, trailing heavy smoke, heading toward the water. Miller watched it. The Zero hit the water approximately 400 yards from the West Virginia, near Ford Island. The aircraft exploded on impact, sending up a huge spray of water and burning fuel. The wreckage sank immediately. First confirmed kill. A Japanese Zero fighter, shot down by a mess attendant who'd never received weapons training. Ensign Delano saw it. He shouted, "You got him, Miller. You got that Zero." Other sailors on the bridge were watching now. They'd seen Miller hit the Zero, seen it crash. Cheers went up, brief and quickly silenced by the ongoing chaos of the battle. Miller didn't respond. He was already tracking another target. A D-3A dive bomber, altitude maybe 900 feet, pulling out of a dive. Miller let it, compensating for its speed and distance, fired. Another burst. Hits along the aircraft's tail and rear fuselage. The D-3A's tail section appeared to buckle slightly. The aircraft wobbled, as if the pilot was struggling with control. It continued flying north, but descending slowly, losing altitude. Miller lost sight of it behind smoke from the burning Arizona. Another damaged aircraft. Possible kill, but unconfirmed. The second .50 caliber machine gun next to Miller was still unmanned. Miller glanced at it, considered trying to operate both guns, dismissed the idea. He couldn't aim 2 guns simultaneously. Better to focus on one gun and use it effectively. The first wave of Japanese aircraft began to withdraw around 8:25 a.m. The attacks diminished. Fewer aircraft were visible over the harbor. The ones still present were departing to the north, back toward their carriers. Miller continued scanning the sky, gun ready. Smoke obscured much of the harbor. Fires burned on multiple ships. The Arizona was a blazing inferno. The Oklahoma had capsized. The West Virginia was settling deeper into the water, the list to port increasing. Damage control parties were working frantically to control flooding and fires. Lieutenant Commander Johnson returned to the bridge. He saw Miller at the machine gun, saw the empty brass casings littering the deck around the gun mount, saw the gun barrel glowing from heat. Johnson asked Miller, "How many rounds have you fired?" Miller didn't know. He'd lost count. He'd been firing for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, in bursts ranging from 3 to 6 seconds. Each burst fired perhaps 30 to 50 rounds. He estimated he'd fired 20 to 25 bursts. That was roughly 600 to 800 rounds. The ammunition belt had been full when he started. It was now nearly empty. Johnson told Miller to cease fire and help with the wounded. The first wave was over. If there was a second wave, they'd need every man helping with damage control and casualties. Miller left the gun and helped carry wounded men from the bridge area to the main deck, where medical personnel were attempting to provide aid. Captain Benyon died at approximately 8:30 a.m. from his wounds. Miller helped carry the captain's body below deck, along with other casualties. The second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived at approximately 8:50 a.m. These were primarily dive bombers and fighters, targeting ships that were still afloat and operational. The West Virginia was already crippled, listing heavily, fires burning. The second wave focused on other targets. Miller returned to the machine gun, but ammunition for the guns on the bridge had been exhausted or was inaccessible due to flooding and fires. Miller couldn't operate the gun without ammunition. He was ordered to help with firefighting instead. The West Virginia continued to settle into the harbor. By 9:30 a.m., it was clear the ship was going to sink. The list to port was increasing. Water was rising in the lower decks. The order was given to prepare to abandon ship. Miller helped evacuate wounded men from the ship to the quay. The West Virginia was moored next to Ford Island. Men could walk off the ship onto the quay if they could reach the mooring lines and gangways. Miller made multiple trips, carrying or supporting wounded sailors off the ship. The West Virginia settled onto the harbor bottom at approximately 10 a.m., coming to rest upright but submerged to the main deck level. The ship hadn't capsized like the Oklahoma because counterflooding had been initiated early, deliberately flooding compartments on the starboard side to offset the list to port from torpedo damage. This counterflooding probably saved dozens of lives by keeping the ship from rolling over. Miller remained with the West Virginia throughout December 7th, helping with firefighting, rescue operations, and recovery of bodies. He was exhausted, covered in oil and soot. His hands burned from hot metal and firefighting equipment. His ears rang from the noise of explosions and sustained machine gun fire. On December 8th, Miller was transferred to the receiving ship USS Argonne, along with other West Virginia survivors. The ship's crew was being reorganized. The West Virginia would remain at Pearl Harbor for months, undergoing salvage and initial repairs before being sent to a shipyard for complete reconstruction. Miller didn't think much about the machine gun. He'd fired at aircraft. He'd hit some. He'd seen one crash. But dozens of sailors had manned anti-aircraft guns throughout the harbor. Many of them had shot down Japanese aircraft or damaged them. Miller assumed his contribution was nothing special. But Ensign Delano thought differently. Delano had watched Miller operate the machine gun, had seen Miller, with no weapons training, figure out how to fire the gun, how to lead targets, how to actually hit fast-moving aircraft, had seen Miller shoot down the Zero. Delano mentioned this in his after-action report. Lieutenant Commander Johnson also mentioned Miller in his report, noting that Mess Attendant Miller manned a machine gun on the bridge and fired at attacking Japanese aircraft with considerable effect. These mentions worked their way up the chain of command. The Navy was under intense scrutiny after Pearl Harbor. The attack had been a disaster. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled. Explanations were demanded. But there are also stories of individual heroism that the Navy wanted to highlight. Acts of courage that showed American sailors had fought back despite being surprised and overwhelmed. Miller's story was compelling. A mess attendant, a rating reserved for black sailors who were officially barred from combat positions, had manned a weapon he'd never been trained to use and had shot down enemy aircraft while under fire. It was the kind of story the Navy could use to demonstrate heroism and fighting spirit. In January 1942, the Navy began investigating which sailors at Pearl Harbor should receive decorations for valor. Miller's name appeared on multiple lists based on the reports from Delano and Johnson. But there was a complication. Initial reports didn't include Miller's full name. The reports referred to him as the Negro mess attendant who manned the machine gun on the West Virginia bridge. The Navy personnel system wasn't efficient at tracking individual mess attendants. There were over 4,000 black mess attendants in the Navy at that time. Finding which specific mess attendant had been on the West Virginia bridge required sorting through crew rosters and interviewing officers. It took several weeks to confirm that the mess attendant in question was Doris Miller. By that time, Miller had been reassigned. He was sent to the USS Indianapolis in early January 1942 as part of that ship's mess attendant complement. The Navy's investigation into Miller's actions at Pearl Harbor concluded in March 1942. The recommendation was that Miller should receive the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest decoration for valor in combat. The Navy Cross was rarely awarded to enlisted men and had never been awarded to a black sailor. The decision to award Miller the Navy Cross generated some internal discussion within the Navy. Some officers questioned whether Miller's actions merited such a high decoration. Others argued that Miller had performed exceptionally under circumstances where most sailors would have been paralyzed by fear or confusion. He'd operated a weapon he'd never been trained on, adapted to the situation, and engaged enemy aircraft effectively. The decision was made to proceed with the Navy Cross, but the citation would be carefully worded. It wouldn't claim Miller had definitely shot down multiple aircraft. Aerial combat was chaotic, and it was often impossible to definitively attribute a kill to a specific gunner. The citation would note that Miller manned a machine gun and fired at attacking Japanese aircraft, and distinguished himself by extraordinary courage and disregard for his own personal safety. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, personally pinned the Navy Cross on Doris Miller aboard the USS Enterprise during a ceremony attended by the press and newsreel cameras. Miller was the first black sailor to receive the Navy Cross. The ceremony was big news. The Navy had been looking for positive stories to counterbalance the ongoing reports of Japanese victories in the Pacific. Miller's story provided that positive narrative, an ordinary sailor performing extraordinary actions under fire. The black press in the United States gave the story extensive coverage. Papers like the Pittsburgh Courier and Chicago Defender ran front-page stories about Miller. He became a symbol of black Americans' contributions to the war effort at a time when the military was still segregated and black service members faced systematic discrimination. Miller was sent on a war bond tour in the summer of 1942, traveling to cities across the United States to promote war bond sales. At each stop, Miller would appear in his uniform with the Navy Cross, speak briefly about Pearl Harbor, and encourage Americans to buy bonds to support the war effort. Miller was not comfortable with public speaking. He was a quiet man, practical, not given to dramatic statements. But he did his duty. After the war bond tour, Miller requested to return to sea duty. He wanted to be on a ship, doing his job, not giving speeches. The Navy granted his request. In November 1942, Miller was assigned to the USS Liscumbe, an escort carrier. The Liscumbe was part of a task force supporting the invasion of the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. On November 24, 1943, the Liscumbe was torpedoed by the Japanese submarine I-175. The torpedo hit the bomb magazine. The Liscumbe exploded and sank in less than 30 minutes. Of the crew of 916, only 272 survived. Doris Miller was not among the survivors. He was 24 years old. The Navy listed Miller as killed in action, presumed dead. His body was never recovered. His family received the standard notification, the folded flag, the condolences of a grateful nation. Miller's story could have ended there, another casualty in a war that killed over 400,000 Americans. But his story had resonance that extended beyond his death. In the decades after World War II, Miller became a symbol in the long struggle to integrate the U.S. military and advance civil rights. The fact that a black sailor, restricted by Navy policy to serving meals, had proven himself in combat by manning a weapon he'd never been trained to use became a powerful argument against racial segregation in the military. President Truman ordered the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces in 1948. The Navy began allowing black sailors to serve in all ratings, not just as mess attendants and stewards. By the Korean War, black sailors were serving as gunners, technicians, and officers. Miller's example had helped pave that path. In 1973, the Navy commissioned the USS Miller, a Knox-class frigate, named in honor of Doris Miller. It was the first U.S. Navy warship named after a black sailor. In 2020, the Navy announced that a Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier, one of the most powerful warships ever built, would be named USS Doris Miller. The carrier is currently under construction and is expected to be commissioned in the late 2020s. But these honors came decades after Miller's death. Miller himself never sought recognition. He'd done what he thought was necessary in the moment. The ship was under attack. There was a gun. No one was firing it, so he fired it. The question often asked about Miller's actions is whether he actually shot down Japanese aircraft. The Navy cross-citation doesn't make specific claims about kills. Post-war analysis of Japanese losses at Pearl Harbor is complicated because Japanese records were incomplete and sometimes conflicting. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft during the Pearl Harbor attack, 9 fighters, 15 dive bombers, and 5 torpedo bombers. Attributing specific kills to specific American gunners is nearly impossible. Hundreds of American gunners were firing at Japanese aircraft. Multiple guns would often engage the same aircraft. Gun camera footage, which might have clarified the issue, was rare on shipboard anti-aircraft guns in 1941. What is certain, based on eyewitness accounts from Ensign Delano and others on the West Virginia Bridge, is that Miller fired at multiple Japanese aircraft, that he achieved hits on several aircraft, and that at least one aircraft he engaged crashed into the harbor near the West Virginia shortly after Miller fired at. Whether that aircraft crashed because of Miller's fire, or because of fire from other guns, or because of a combination of damage from multiple sources, cannot be definitively determined. Naval combat after-action reports from World War II are filled with such ambiguities. The chaos of battle, the smoke, the confusion, the multiple overlapping fields of fire all made it difficult to assess exactly what happened. What matters more than the specific number of kills is what Miller's actions represented. He was a 22-year-old mess attendant who found himself in a situation where he could either take action or do nothing. He chose to take action. He figured out how to operate a weapon he'd never been trained on. He adapted under fire. He engaged the enemy effectively despite having no formal preparation for that role. Miller's story also highlights the absurdity of the Navy's racial policies in 1941. Here was a sailor who proved himself capable of operating an anti-aircraft gun in combat, hitting targets, defending his ship. Yet Navy policy prevented him from training for that role, from advancing to gunner's mate rating, from using his demonstrated abilities in an official capacity. Miller returned to serving meals after Pearl Harbor. When he received the Navy Cross, he remained a mess attendant. The Navy didn't promote him to a combat rating. That wasn't allowed under the regulations of the time. The Navy could give him a medal, but it couldn't give him the opportunity to formally serve in the role he'd proven he could perform. This contradiction wasn't lost on Black Americans or on progressive whites who were pushing for military integration. Miller had demonstrated, under the most extreme circumstances possible, that race was irrelevant to combat performance. Yet the Navy maintained policies based on the assumption that black sailors were unsuited for combat roles. Miller didn't speak publicly about this contradiction. He wasn't a political person. He was a sailor. He did his job. When asked about Pearl Harbor in interviews during his war bond tour, Miller spoke simply, "I saw a gun. Nobody was firing it. We were under attack, so I fired it. That's all." That simplicity is part of what makes Miller's story powerful. He didn't do what he did to prove a point about race. He didn't do it to become a hero. He did it because it needed doing, and he was there, and he could do it. The broader significance came later, when others recognized that Miller's actions had implications for how the military thought about race and combat roles. There's a final aspect of Miller's story worth considering. Miller manned that machine gun for approximately 15 to 20 minutes during the first wave of the attack. During that time, he fired an estimated 600 to 800 rounds. He engaged multiple targets. He hit several aircraft. He shot down at least one, possibly more. But Miller had thousands of counterparts across the harbor that morning. Hundreds of sailors manned anti-aircraft guns on dozens of ships. Many of them had formal training as gunners. Many of them also hit Japanese aircraft. Many of them also shot down enemy planes. Some of them also died at their guns, killed by Japanese fire while they were defending their ships. Miller's actions were exemplary, but not unique in the narrow sense. What made his actions unique was that he achieved them despite systematic exclusion from the training and opportunities that his white counterparts received. He achieved them as an act of initiative and adaptation rather than as the execution of a trained skill. In that sense, Miller's story raises a question about how many other black sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines during World War II possessed abilities and potential that were never recognized, never developed, never utilized because of the military's racial policies. How much talent was wasted? How much courage went unrecognized? How many Doris Millers were there who never got the chance to show what they could do? The military began to grapple with these questions during and after World War II. The eventual integration of the armed forces in 1948 was driven by multiple factors: moral arguments about equality, political pressure from civil rights advocates, and practical recognition that segregation was inefficient and wasteful of human potential. Miller's example contributed to that recognition. Here was concrete proof that the assumptions underlying segregation were false. A mess attendant could man an anti-aircraft gun. A black sailor could shoot down enemy aircraft. Race had nothing to do with the ability to serve effectively in combat. Doris Miller didn't set out to change Navy policy or advance civil rights. He set out that morning to collect laundry. The Japanese attack forced him into a situation where he had to make choices. He made good choices. He acted with courage and effectiveness. And in doing so, he became part of a larger story about justice, equality, and the gradual recognition that all Americans, regardless of race, deserve the opportunity to serve and to be judged on their abilities rather than their skin color. Miller's life was cut short at age 24. He never saw the integrated military that his example helped create. He never saw the ships named in his honor. He never knew that his actions on December 7, 1941, would be remembered and studied decades later. But his shipmates remembered. The men who served with Miller, who watched him man that gun, who saw him shoot down that Zero, they remembered. They told the story. And the story persisted because it was true and because it mattered. Ensign Victor Delano, who was on the West Virginia Bridge with Miller, wrote in a 1942 letter to his family, "I watched that mess attendant figure out how to fire a machine gun in the middle of the worst attack any of us had ever experienced. He didn't panic. He didn't freeze. He just started shooting, and he hit what he aimed at. I've seen trained gunners who couldn't perform that well under those conditions. That man deserved better than the Navy gave him." Lieutenant Commander Dwar Johnson, in a 1962 interview for a Navy oral history project, said, "Miller's actions at Pearl Harbor demonstrated something important. When the emergency came, when the ship needed every man to fight, that sailor performed. He performed without training, without preparation, just with courage and common sense. That should have told us something about our personnel policies. Unfortunately, it took us too long to learn the lesson." These reflections from officers who witnessed Miller's actions underscore what made his story significant. It wasn't just about one man's courage. It was about what that courage revealed about flawed assumptions and unjust policies. There are memorials to Doris Miller in several locations. A park in Waco, Texas, his hometown, is named in his honor. A hall at the Naval Station Great Lakes, where Miller took his initial training, bears his name. The frigate and future aircraft carrier carry his name. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is the change he helped inspire. The integrated military, where service members are judged on their performance rather than their race, is Miller's legacy. Every black sailor who serves on an aircraft carrier, every black Marine who qualifies as a marksman, every black Air Force pilot who flies fighters, every black Army soldier who leads troops in combat stands on a path that Doris Miller helped clear. He didn't clear it alone. Many others fought that fight in combat and in the long political struggle for civil rights. But Miller's contribution was real and specific. He showed, under the most intense pressure imaginable, that courage and ability have no color. Miller died doing his duty, serving on a ship in combat. He died as thousands of other American service members died in World War II, killed by enemy action, trying to complete the mission. His death was a tragedy, but also a testament. He'd requested to return to sea duty. He'd wanted to be on a ship, doing his job. He got his wish, and he served until the end. The lesson from Doris Miller's life isn't complicated. It's the lesson that emerges from thousands of stories from World War II, from all wars, from all human endeavors. When people are given the opportunity to show what they can do, many of them will exceed expectations. When people are denied that opportunity based on arbitrary characteristics like race, everyone loses. Society loses the contributions those people could have made. The individuals lose the chance to reach their potential. Miller reached his potential in 15 minutes, on a burning ship under attack. He showed what he could do when given the chance, even though the chance came by accident, as a result of emergency rather than policy. The tragedy is that Miller and thousands like him should never have needed an emergency to get that chance. They should have been trained, prepared, and welcomed into combat roles from the beginning. That didn't happen in 1941. It took years, and the evidence of men like Miller and political pressure and moral arguments and practical necessity to change the system. But the system did eventually change. Progress was slow, incomplete, and resisted, but it happened. And when people ask why it happened, when they look for the evidence that forced change, Doris Miller's story is part of the answer. A mess attendant on the USS West Virginia, collecting laundry when the attack began, manning a machine gun he'd never been trained to use, shooting down Japanese aircraft while his ship burned and sank beneath him. That image, that story, that proof of ability and courage, helped change minds and change policies. There are thousands of stories from World War II that haven't been told or recognized, so it's our duty to share them somehow. Doris Miller's story has been told, but it bears repeating because it speaks to something fundamental about human potential and human dignity. Miller didn't ask for recognition. He just did what needed doing. That he had to overcome systematic discrimination to do it makes his achievement more remarkable and the discrimination more indefensible. Miller's legacy is both his individual courage and the broader change that courage helped inspire. Both are worth remembering.